Hello, I hope this story touches you to the core. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome. Dorothy was sitting in her kitchen, leaning on the old wooden table that she remembered from her youth. On the table was a phone that had been silent for several days. Jack, her only son, used to always find time to call or write, but lately his voice had become a rare memory. As she dialed his number again and once again received a short message, "The subscriber cannot accept your call." Dorothy sighed heavily. Her heart told her that something was wrong. Jack was her pride. After her husband's death, he was the only person she had left close to her. She remembered helping him with his homework, supporting him when he started his career. They had always been a team. When Jack introduced her to Sarah, she tried to be nice. Sarah was charming, but she always left behind a sense of hidden superiority. She's ambitious," Jack said when Dorothy gently hinted that Sarah sometimes acted abruptly, "which is good." Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was her friend Mary, who always came when she felt something was wrong. "But you look worried," Mary said as she sat down at the table. "Jack isn't answering," Dorothy admitted. Maybe he's busy," Mary suggested. "I'd believe it if it was just a day or two," Dorothy replied. "But it's been over a week." Dorothy decided to call Sarah. She believed that her daughter-in-law would be able to clarify the situation. Sarah answered almost immediately. "Hello, Dorothy." Her voice was cold. "Hira, what's going on? I've been trying to reach Jack, but he's not answering." "He's busy," Sarah replied briefly. "Busy?" Dorothy asked again. "He's never been so busy that he can't find a moment for his mother." Sarah was silent for a moment and then answered, "Maybe you should give him some space." These words shook Dorothy to the bone. "Space? She repeated. "What do you mean? Just think about it," Sarah said and hung up. Dorothy put the phone down on the table, feeling her hands shaking. Her mind couldn't comprehend what had happened. She's up to something," she said aloud, more to herself than to Mary. What do you mean?" her friend asked. She's trying to keep me away from Jack," Dorothy replied. "But I don't understand why." Dorothy sat in silence, looking at the phone. She knew this was only the beginning, and she was sure she would have to fight to understand what was happening. The next morning, Dorothy woke up with a feeling of heaviness in her chest. She was thinking about Jack's strange behavior and Sarah's words, and couldn't get enough of them. She decided to find out what was going on. Jack had always been calm and sensitive. After his father died, he took on the responsibility of supporting his mother. Even when he married Sarah, he remained a loving son. Sarah was his complete opposite. She grew up in a wealthy family and was used to getting what she wanted. Ambitious, straightforward, and often abrupt, she quickly showed that she had a strong character. "I always achieve my goals," she once said during one of their dinners together. Dorothy smiled, but something in those words alarmed her. A year ago, Sarah asked Dorothy to help her financially with her business, which was an online designer clothing store. "It's a great investment," she said, showing her business plans. "I know I can make it into something great." But Dorothy, who was always careful with money, said no. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said. "I can't risk my life savings." Sarah tried not to show her disappointment, but Dorothy could see her face tense. After that conversation, the relationship between them changed. Sarah became more cold, and Jack started calling his mother less often. At first, Dorothy put it down to their busy schedules, but now she realized that the problem went deeper. Mary, who was always there for her, came to Dorothy that day with a warm pie. "You look upset," she said as she poured the tea. "I think Sarah is trying to keep me away from Jack," Dorothy replied. "Why do you think that?" Dorothy told her about Sarah's request for money and her strange behavior lately. "It could be a coincidence," Mary suggested. No, Dorothy replied confidently. "I know it's not." Dorothy decided to call Jack again, but this time he answered. "Hi, Mom," he said, but he sounded tense. "Hi, dear. I was worried you hadn't called for a while." "I'm sorry, I've been busy," Jack replied shortly. Jack, is something wrong?" she asked. Jack was silent for a few seconds and then answered, "Mom, maybe you need to respect our space a little more." These words were like a bolt from the blue for her. "Space? She asked. "What do you mean?" "Just give us some time," he said and hung up. Dorothy put the phone down, feeling her hands shaking. "What did she say to him?" she whispered. Dorothy realized that she had lost something important, but she was sure of one thing: she would not let it go. Dorothy couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Jack's words on the phone kept coming back to her. She decided that she would not sit idly by any longer. If Sarah was trying to destroy her relationship with her son, she had to find out why. The next day, Dorothy decided to talk to Sarah directly. She called her and asked for a meeting. Don't think it's a good idea," Sarah replied. "But it's necessary," Dorothy insisted. "We have to talk about some things." Eventually, Sarah agreed. Dorothy was determined, but she tried to remain calm. She remembered what Mary had said. "The main thing is not to show emotion. Speak clearly, but don't blame." Dorothy knew it would not be easy. They met in a small cafe in the city center. Sarah looked flawless as always, a stylish suit, perfect makeup, but her eyes showed irritation. "What did you want to discuss?" she asked, sitting down at the table. Dorothy took and began. "Sarah, I feel like there's a distance between me and Jack, and I think it's because of you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, trying to look surprised. "Because of me? What do you mean?" Jack was always very close to me," Dorothy continued. "But after I refused to finance your business, he started to pull away." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "Do you think I'm turning him against you?" And you're not?" Dorothy asked, looking her straight in the eye. Sarah put down her coffee cup and leaned closer. "Listen, Dorothy," she said coldly, "Jack is my husband, and I have the right to have him put our family first." And I'm not his family anymore?" Dorothy asked, feeling her voice tremble. "You were," Sarah replied, "but now he has new priorities." These words were like a knife to the heart. Dorothy felt her face flush with anger. "I will not let you take my son away from me," she said firmly. "Take him away," Sarah laughed. "He is a grown man and makes his own choices. If he doesn't like you, it's not my fault." Dorothy realized that Sarah had no intention of changing her behavior. On the contrary, she was enjoying being in control. "This isn't over," Dorothy said, getting up from the table. Sarah remained seated with a smile that said more than any words. Dorothy left the cafe with a heavy heart. She knew that the fight would not be easy, but she was not going to give up. Dorothy returned home after her meeting with Sarah, feeling defeated. Her words about new priorities left a bitter mark on her soul. But at the same time, Dorothy's spirit of struggle was awakened. She knew that Sarah was hiding something, and she decided to find the evidence. That evening, Dorothy received a call from her old friend Julia, who worked as an accountant. "Hi, Dorothy," she began. "I have some information that might interest you." "What's wrong?" Dorothy asked, feeling her heart racing. "Remember you said that Sarah was starting a business?" "Yes, and I refused to invest in it," Dorothy replied. "Well," Julia continued, "I happened to see her financial documents. There are some very strange transactions there." Julia explained that Sarah had received a substantial amount of money from one of her business partners, but that the money had quickly disappeared from the account. "It looks like she's not using the money for the business," Julia said, "or she's doing double-entry bookkeeping. This is important," Dorothy replied. "Can you help me find out more?" The next day, Dorothy met with Julia, who showed her Sarah's bank statements. Look here," Julia said, pointing to a document. "She received $30,000 from an investor, but within a week the money was transferred to another account." "Whose account is this?" Dorothy asked. There's a name on there that doesn't mean anything to me," Julia replied, "but it looks suspicious." Dorothy began to remember Sarah saying several times that her business was struggling. She often mentioned debt, but now Dorothy wondered if that was true. She could be using the money for personal needs, Julia suggested. "That would explain why she wanted me to invest my savings so badly." Dorothy said. Then Dorothy decided to share her suspicions with Mary. This is getting worse, she told her friend. If it's true, you should tell Jack, Mary replied. But he won't believe me, Dorothy replied. Sarah has already turned him against me. Dorothy decided to find more evidence. She remembered that Jack had once shown her pictures of a celebration Sarah had organized for investors. In one of the pictures was a man she recognized as one of her old friends. If it's who I think it is, he can help me, Dorothy said. Dorothy picked up the phone and dialed the number. Hi, this is Dorothy, she said. We need to talk. Like she felt like she was starting to get closer to the truth, but at the same time she was afraid that these revelations could destroy everything. Dorothy spent several days thinking about her next steps. On Kim, she knew that simply accusing Sarah without proof would not help. She needed to find a way to get through to Jack so that he would start to question his wife. Dorothy called Jack. Jack, I know you're busy, but can we meet? It's important, she said. Mom, I don't know if that's a good idea, he replied. It's about Sarah, she added, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Okay, but only for a few minutes, he relented. They met at the cafe that had once been their favorite place. Jack looked tense but listened intently. Jack, I know you trust Sarah, Dorothy began. But I found something that might interest you. She pulled out the documents Julia had shown her. What are these? He asked, frowning. These are Sarah's financial statements, she replied. Look, there are some transactions that look very strange. Jack looked at the documents carefully. $30,000, he asked. Why didn't she tell me anything about this? Because she's hiding something, Dorothy answered. Mom, are you sure this isn't a mistake? He asked, but his voice sounded less certain. Dorothy remembered the man in the photo and found his contact. He agreed to meet with her and Jack to talk about his experience with Sarah. She promised big profits, the investor said when they met, but after I invested the money, it just disappeared. Jack listened and his face gradually became more serious. Are you sure? He asked. And I have all the documents, the investor replied, pulling out a folder. Jack returned home with a heavy heart. He decided to talk to Sarah. Sarah, I have a question, he began. What happened? Her voice was tense. I found out about the $30,000 you received from the investor. Why didn't you tell me anything? Sarah was silent for a few seconds, then answering, it was for business. I didn't want to worry you. But why did the money disappear from the account? Jack insisted. Sarah tried to evade him. It's hard to explain. The investor wanted a refund. But why didn't you tell me earlier? He asked. Because I knew you wouldn't understand, she replied, but her voice didn't sound as confident as usual. Jack silently went to his room, leaving Sarah alone. Doubts began to grow in his heart. He loved his wife, but now he felt betrayed. The next day, Jack, who was still in a state of reflection after his conversation with his mother, decided to act. He needed answers, and he knew he couldn't move on until he found out the truth. Jack invited Dorothy and Sarah to his house. He said he wanted to discuss an important matter, but he did not disclose the details. We need to talk, he said when everyone was gathered in the living room. Sarah looked confident, but there was a slight hint of nervousness in her eyes. Dorothy, on the other hand, was calm although her heart was racing with anxiety. Mom, Sarah, I'm tired of this tension between you two, Jack began. He looked at Sarah. Sarah, I found the financial records. Mom showed them to me, and I want you to explain what happened to that money. Sarah frowned. Jack, I told you it was for business, she replied. But the money is gone, Jack insisted. Dorothy decided to intervene. Jack, I know you love Sarah, but you have to look at the facts, she said. I have proof that the money was never used for business. You're always meddling, Sarah exclaimed, turning to Dorothy. You're the reason Jack can't live in peace. That's not true, Dorothy replied. I just want him to see who you really are. Jack raised his voice, trying to stop the argument. That's enough, he shouted. I want to hear the truth. He turned to Sarah again. Sarah, tell me honestly what happened to that money. Sarah lowered her head. Okay, she said quietly. I used it to pay off personal debts. The words came as a shock to Jack. You lied to me, he asked, looking at her with pain in his eyes. I was afraid you wouldn't understand, Sarah answered. I thought I could fix it if you didn't find out. Dorothy couldn't help herself. Jack, do you see now that I was right? She's been manipulating you all along. Sarah looked up sharply. I did it for us, she exclaimed, not because of her constant interference. Jack stood up, feeling a mixture of anger and frustration. You're both right and wrong, he said. Sarah, you should have told me the truth. And, Mom, you shouldn't have used it to stir up conflict. He looked at both women. But I want this to be over. I can't live between you two anymore. Jack walked out of the room, leaving Dorothy and Sarah in a tense silence. Both women realized that the conflict had caused damage that could not be easily repaired. Jack sat in his office, closing his eyes and clutching his temples. He felt torn between the two most important women in his life. His mother, who had been his support since childhood, and his wife, whom he had chosen in the hope of a happy future. Jack recalled his childhood. Dorothy was always there for him. She supported him in school, helped him prepare for exams, even saved money so he could go to college. She always put me first, he thought. But now, looking at the situation, he realized how far he had drifted away from his mother. He also loved Sarah. She was energetic and ambitious, and these were the qualities that had once attracted him. But her deception about money had left a painful mark. She should have trusted me, he thought. Jack decided to turn to his friend Tom, who always gave him wise advice. What would you do in my place? Jack asked. It's a tough one, Tom replied. But I think you have to ask yourself one question: who are you more afraid of losing? These words made Jack even deeper. That evening, Jack sat down next to Sarah in their living room. She looked tense but tried to smile. Jack, I know I made a mistake, she said, but I did it for us. He asked, Sarah, you lied to me. You decided it was better to hide the truth than to trust me. Sarah lowered her head. I didn't want to lose you, she whispered. But you risked losing me because of your lies, Jack said. The next day, Jack went to his mother's house. She met him at the door, looking worried but happy. I'm glad you came, she said, hugging him. They sat down in the kitchen and Jack started talking. Mom, I know you've always wanted the best for me, but you can't control my life. No, I don't want to control you, Dorothy replied. I just want you to be happy and see the truth. Jack sighed. Both Sarah and you have made mistakes, and I don't want to lose either of you. But that means you have to find a way to coexist. Jack, I'm always ready to reconcile, Dorothy said. Jack returned home and brought Sarah and Dorothy together. I'm not going to let this situation destroy our family, he said, but it's going to take work on both sides. Sarah nodded, though she looked uncertain. I'm willing to try, she said. So am I, Dorothy added. Jack felt he had made the right choice, but deep down, he knew there was still a lot of work to be done to rebuild trust. Weeks had passed since the tense conversation where Jack had forced Sarah and Dorothy to agree to a truce. Life seemed to be back to normal, but deep down, all three of them felt that the conflict had left a deep mark. Dorothy tried not to interfere in her son and daughter-in-law's lives, as she had promised Jack, as she no longer called every day and even avoided discussing finances. But she noticed that Jack was looking more and more preoccupied. When they met, he was attentive, but always focused on something else. Are you happy? She asked one day. Jack smiled, but there was something elusive in his eyes. Everything is fine, Mom, he answered. Sarah tried to be more attentive to Jack. She often cooked dinner and organized romantic evenings, but it was more like an attempt to hide her anxiety than genuine care. One day, when Jack returned home, he found Sarah nervously talking on the phone. I can't talk now, she said quickly and hung up. Who was that? Jack asked. No one important, Sarah replied, but her voice betrayed the tension. Jack began to feel that their life was more like a game than a real family. He began to pay attention to the little things: unexpected expenses, Sarah's absence at home at strange hours, her nervousness. Why didn't I notice anything before? He thought. Dorothy, for her part, decided to focus on herself. She started taking a painting class, which she had always wanted to try. Her days became more fulfilling, and she felt like she was coming back to life. But even amidst her new hobbies, she couldn't completely let go of her son's thoughts. Maybe I didn't do enough to protect him, she thought. One evening, Jack came to his mother's house unannounced. He looked tired and a little confused. "What's wrong, Jack?" she asked as she poured him some tea. I don't know, Mom," he replied. "I think I made a bad choice." Dorothy felt her heart sink. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Everything," he replied. "I feel like I'm standing between two worlds that can never come together." Jack left, leaving Dorothy with more questions. Was he ready to leave Sarah? Would he be able to maintain a balance between his wife and his mother? Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting at home, holding her phone and looking at an unknown number. She looked tense, as if something important was slipping out of her control again. Dorothy looked at the photo of her son as a young man and felt a mixture of pain and hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts. What would you have done in Jack's shoes?